good to see that although we don't have a large crowd here, we have some interested members of our economics unit, and I hope the people who are here are going to be able to ask some interesting questions and join in the discourse. It's a great pleasure at this week's forum for me to be able to introduce Jan-Peter Olters, the new resident representative of the World Bank Group in Kosovo. Dr. Olters comes from the beautiful city of Lübeck on the Baltic coast of Germany. I guess it's not too fanciful to think that Lübeck, with its Hanseatic traditions of banking and shipping and international trade and development, has something of a tradition that you've inherited, sir, in your role now at the World Bank. But, without further ado, it's a great pleasure and honor to welcome you here to the American University, and we look forward to your talk, which is going to be, as I understand it, on the theme of the European financial crisis and how it will impact Kosovo's development. Dr. Olters.
Thank you very much, Professor, for the invitation. Thank you for your interest. I thought it would make sense, given that since late last summer, there are essentially only two topics dominating the headlines day after day, week after week. One, of course, being the situation in the north, I won't be talking about that. And the other one being the euro crisis, and the fact that that every day things certainly are not improving on that front. This topic, I think, related to the euro crisis, is not only important because Kosovo is using and has adopted the euro as a legal tender, which would be a reason valid in itself. But I think the crisis contains sufficiently important lessons that, learned correctly, could contribute to Kosovo's ability to retain and build on its very solid growth performance in recent years, and as such start to close the income gap with other countries in Europe. And I think it was the former chief of staff of President Barack Obama and the current mayor of Chicago who can be credited with a quote, "You never let a serious crisis go to waste." And what I mean by that's an opportunity to do things that you think you could not do before. And I think in this current situation, I will take full advantage of this crisis for what comes next. With that in mind, I will be starting with looking at the crisis currently unfolding in Greece. A crisis that risks affecting neighboring countries, particularly those in the southern part of the Eurozone as well. And in so doing, I see three root causes that coexist and seem to be reinforcing one another. Of course, the one factor that is most frequently quoted and discussed in the debate about the current euro crisis is the fiscal factor. And then this can be summarized, I think, in a few key indicators and be contrasted to the original design of the Eurozone. I mean, as you know, the Stability and Growth Pact, or often referred to as the Maastricht criteria, had defined as caps to fiscal deficits and public debt levels of 3% and 60% of GDP respectively. 10 years, a little bit more than a decade later, we have realized that policymakers in Europe have been struggling to enforce these self-imposed rules. While the Eurozone averages for both of these fiscal indicators during the pre-crisis, that is up until 2008 period, were somewhat encouraging and then seemed to represent some validity to the original design. Things have become a whole lot worse and deteriorated in the wake of the crisis and have forced policymakers to discuss, debate, and design on the architecture and trying to fix gaps that existed in the architecture before. And rather than the 3 and the 60% that were outlined, we've seen that during the post-crisis period for the Eurozone as a whole, we had figures of 5.5 and 85% respectively. That is considerably higher than what was foreseen. And for Greece, the country most affected by the current crisis, the difficulties reflect the combination of legacy issues compounded with the effects from the current global financial crisis. Because even during the pre-crisis years, the average fiscal deficit stood at around 6% of GDP, that is twice as high as was foreseen, and that at an existing stock of debt that exceeded the 100% of GDP. And that, of course, even in a good environment, causes immense difficulty. And with the effects of the crisis, things start to spin out of control. And if you look at the figures for 2009, 2011, the latest projections for 2011, we see figures of 11.3 and 145% of GDP. And I think the current difficulties are a reflection of that. But in the end, even though we talk about the fiscal challenges a lot, I think the underlying issue for the weakest countries in the Eurozone are challenges of productivity and competitiveness. While the Eurozone as a whole can be considered healthy, as reflected in an average current account surplus for the years 2000-2011 of about 0.2% of Eurozone GDP, it is characterized by a very considerable divergence among Eurozone countries. During that period of time, if you look, and again take Greece as an example, it had a current account deficit as average for these 11 years of 9.3% of GDP. And I think here lies the crux of the economic conundrum. If the exports of goods and services pay for only a small amount of imports, I mean, it is in the end the efficiency of production that is the core problem, especially if an economy operates under constraints of a fixed exchange rate regime. In such a setup, policymakers are precluded from using currency depreciation as an instrument to either boost international competitiveness and or to offset wage increases in excess of productivity increases. If a country proves unwilling or unable to do so, that is, to address the underlying structural challenges of an economy head-on, it will struggle with the interplay of low productivity, deficits both in the external and fiscal balances. Such a country would risk suffering from sustained periods of economic stagnation, rising rates of unemployment, and increasing poverty, either gradually, because companies are faced increased difficulty in being competitive in the marketplace, or in the wake of an acute fiscal and or balance of payment crisis, as we are seeing right now. I think this brings us to the third element that explains the severity of the current crisis. I think being able to clearly identify the weak links in the current architecture of the Eurozone, it is easy to speculate against the euro. We know there has not been any love lost for the common currency in the financial centers of New York and London. And this clear ability to identify the weakest link or to form the expectation of what the others in the marketplace think facilitates such a conduct. And all of these three elements, I think, do explain to a large extent the economic difficulties that we're facing in and around the Eurozone right now. I think the debate on the speculation and the role that the credit rating agencies have played in all of that will trigger a lot of papers and studies, and I think will stimulate a very, very interesting debate coming our way. I'm looking forward to reading the papers, but I'm not going into that discussion right now. I think I will turn back and really ask the question, what does this all mean for Kosovo? Before I come to that, let me just summarize in a sentence or two. I think there's three key features of where Kosovo is right now as I see it. First, Kosovo has grown much more solidly than most other countries in Central and Eastern Europe. Secondly, its unemployment and employment figures are much worse than anywhere in the region. And thirdly, its per capita income is still quite a bit lower than including in this particular region, the Western Balkans. That said, the key lesson that I can draw from the Euro-related events for Kosovo is the conviction that the focus of any socio-economic development strategy would have to stand on two pillars. Namely, first, protecting fiscal strength, and secondly, fostering increases in productivity and competitiveness. On the first point, Kosovo will need to maintain its fiscal strength to be able both to protect a certain fiscal buffer should the external environment deteriorate. And if we look forward to 2012, looks difficult, both because of the euro crisis, but also possibly because of difficulties in keeping the US economy and the government running. And secondly, to create a sufficient fiscal space to implement the very ambitious public investment agenda. Typically, I mean, Kosovo spends a lot on investments, and it is typically that part of the budget with the highest socioeconomic benefits, but it has to be financed, and that space has to exist. Secondly, any development strategy has to aim at increasing the economy's productivity and its international competitiveness. And for economists, and if you are, you know, competitiveness is a relatively complex, almost economic concept. The standard definition of competitiveness, typically related to real wages and the real effective exchange rate, was challenged. And then I'm sure some of you have read the article in 1994 by Paul Krugman, professor at the Princeton University and a Nobel Prize winner, who described it as a seductive ideal promising easy answers to complex problems. He warned his colleagues, and maybe particularly policymakers, that thinking in terms of competitiveness leads directly or indirectly to bad economic policies on a wide range of issues. According to him, it is domestic productivity growth, not some measure of competitiveness, that determines the country's welfare, which in turn is a function of capital, know-how, and technology that, among other things, foreign direct investment can bring into a country. This broader competitiveness concept thus comprises elements of the business climate, the legal framework, contract enforcement, labor force qualifications, and the quality of public institutions and infrastructure, and not least, the education of its people. A competitive economy would thus be one that managed to foster high-quality export sector, that fosters the development of a high-quality export sector. And with that, I mean one with a stable demand base over the entire business cycle, and the capacity to easily adapt to changing and especially unfavorable external environments. The bar seems high, but the challenge in Kosovo's case appears more daunting on first glance than it actually is. To be successful, Kosovo would need to take full advantage of the so-called latecomer advantage. Against this backdrop, policy priorities seem to be evident and would comprise measures to narrow the gap in infrastructure, technology, and skills with higher income countries. In short, Kosovo would need to absorb the relevant standards and their experiences. However, for this to work and to provide the foundation on which to foster development that allows for productivity to increase at a sufficiently dynamic pace, and, in consequence, vacancies and wages to rise, it appears most effective to concentrate efforts on attracting strategic domestic and foreign direct investments from companies that are able to bring in not only the capital and the resources, but also the technology and the know-how. That means that the quality of investors matters as much as the funds that they're able to bring into the country. Once here, we are back on safe territory. As in many respects, investors are easy to understand. Their motivations are clearly defined and consistent across origin, sector, and size. To consider Kosovo as a possible location for investment, entrepreneurs would need to have confidence in the ability to amortize the outlays within a reasonable period of time and earn profits thereafter. And this confidence aspect is crucial, especially for domestic or foreign factory owners whose networks do not reach into the upper echelons of government. Overall, countries tend to be more successful in attracting investments if investors have developed trust in institutions and ability to apply laws, rules, regulations uniformly, and in so doing, create a level playing field for all companies in the marketplace. This is often referred to as a country's soft infrastructure. In Kosovo's case, high quality, productivity increasing investments have happened in the banking sector, a sector that has been professionally supervised, but it remains outstanding in many other sectors. It is thus not surprising to see that the European Commission's recently published progress report focuses on and highlights these very issues as priority areas for reform. As such, the document provides critically important input to the derivation of strategic medium-term policy priorities, which, if implemented, will serve two purposes at once, namely to facilitate the realizations of Kosovo's political integration objectives, namely EU integration, and its economic policy goals, namely, essentially, to create more jobs and better living conditions. There is no single policy or a single measure that can foster the increase in productivity or allow for tangible employment growth or improve the overall living conditions. The key to success lies in a series of reforms aimed at strengthening the legal framework, the functioning of public institutions, and the quality of services provided by the public administration, and all of that within a sustainable fiscal framework. And let me end with a little bit of self-promotion. I think it is here where the World Bank can contribute the most and provide support to bring Kosovo's economy onto a trajectory of dynamic, sustainable, and inclusive rates of economic growth. It will remain an artist's journey, but with a clear vision of direction, you have half the success. With that, I thank you for your interest, and I'm open to any questions you might have. Thank you very much.
Okay, I will do the moderation of the questions. Just thank you for your remarks, and who would like to go first? I see a lot of panelists here. Chris?
Nobody else will.
If I may, until this week, when the Greek Prime Minister called for a referendum, I thought that any possible dissolution of the euro was unthinkable. I guess it's still highly improbable, but maybe we ought to start thinking the unthinkable. So my question is, does Kosovo have any alternative to the euro, other than perhaps going back to the Deutschmark? And should Kosovo have a plan B? Should we be thinking the unthinkable at a policy level?
Well, the latter point, going back to the Deutschmark, is the same as staying with the euro. I mean, I still, despite all difficulties, given the immense amount of political investment, capital invested in the project of the common currency, I think every effort is being made to salvage the euro. And from what I can take, watching and reading about the press conference given yesterday in Cannes, I heard a slight change in emphasis, putting safeguarding the euro before saving Greece. To some extent, I think there was a very strong emphasis put on the government in Greece to collaborate and work closely with and keep informed the other members of the Eurozone. I mean, it is a partnership, and I think with that press conference, this partnership was demanded. It is a very unexpected development, and I think we are all struggling a little bit to fully understand the rationale for that.
If I can follow up.
So if you don't mind a quick follow-up. Are there particular potential consequences for countries like Montenegro and Kosovo, which are not officially part of the Eurozone but adopt the Euro? Could there be pressure upon these countries to go elsewhere, as it were, if Greece leaves the Eurozone, for example?
Well, since they have never been invited, they cannot be uninvited. So in the end, when we've got 3 countries that use the euro but have no agreement with the ECB. Kosovo, Montenegro, and Andorra. I heard it. And in these 3 countries, policies have to be made knowing there won't be a bailout. So a particular emphasis has to be placed on either making sure that the fundamentals are right, that you can live within the constraints of using the euro, or you have to think about alternatives. But the same umbrella, the same support that is provided to Greece or other countries within the Eurozone is not available to a country like Kosovo. So that places particular responsibility of policymakers in these 3 countries.
When you described or listed the priorities of governance in the periods of crisis, you said that in the case of Kosovo, it will be very crucial to maintain fiscal strength, and second, to develop the competitiveness. For the first element, this will mean that to maintain something that we don't have. Kosovo is characterized with a weak fiscal policy, and this is what IMF is saying constantly. So which means that actually, with respect to the first priority, we will not score very good. The second one, which has to do with the policies that can increase the competitiveness, you mentioned among others the quality of institutions, which we know is very low, and the quality of education and healthcare, which is also at a very low level. Can we be optimistic under such conditions?
I think you raised a few good points. Let me go back first to, and the characterization of the fiscal position is actually a little bit more difficult. And you have, because of the high unemployment or the very low formal employment, you have a very narrow tax base, which limits the size of the budget relative to the investment needs that the country has. I think that's the weak part of the fiscal situation. At the same time, the stock of public debt is very, very low, and the fiscal deficit is still lower than in most countries, even within the region. So there is a certain part of the fiscal equation that is much stronger than its reputation. The challenge here, of course, is to square the circle in a way that even with this small tax base that we have right now, to finance that what needs to be financed, foster growth, increase the pie, and then sort of get towards a budget that allows to accomplish more objectives and goals that we have. That said, when we are looking at, say, the wage levels, per capita income, the quality of institutions, the standard of productivity. Right? I think that's where we have the link. And we have the comparatively low wages because productivity is comparatively low. But when I said, let's take full advantage of the latecomer advantage, that means, we sort of know where we're heading. And it's relatively easy. So the first part of this development strategy is much easier than the latter bit, because you have a clear direction where you want to go. And I think if you look at those countries that have been successful, that have been growing dynamically, and take Turkey. And Turkey in recent years has grown at very, very dynamic rates. The basic structure, the ground is much bigger, and that you cannot change. But in many other aspects, the starting point was not all that dissimilar. And then the more you can draw lessons from the way the Turks have sort of turned the economy around, which just a few years ago was crisis prone, was the Greece of 5 years ago or 10 years ago. I think that's an area where you can see that with the emphasis on strengthening institutions, on improving the implementation of laws. Many laws that you have are actually good, but the next step then is to implement them fully, to make sure that the private sector has a foundation on which you can safely expect to make profits over a reasonable period of time. With all of these factors, you can turn around the country relatively quickly. And I think the more one takes advantage of these good examples, even within this region, if you look into Asia, you've got more examples, but maybe the starting point is somewhat more dissimilar. You've got a number of small countries in the Baltic region, starting with Estonia, and there are good examples coming from there. So I think the more Kosovo can take advantage of these experiences, import some of the experiences, and implement them, the quicker you can achieve that. And that's roughly what I meant when I talked about taking advantage of the latecomer advantage.
If I can follow up on this, we never lack good examples. We had Turkey now, we had Ireland a few years ago, or decades, we had South Korea, and the problem was not in the lack of examples or good models. The problem is in the ability of countries to adopt or implement such policies. And this is where the quality of institution matters. There will always be successful countries and there will also be failures. And the problem is to determine what makes a difference. And this is where the education, health, quality of institution comes in. So it's true that we have good legislation, but we know in the last 12 years that the problem was never in getting a good legislation, the problem was in implementing it. And we know this for 10 years, but we never showed willingness to change this. That's the problem.
But that I'm also counting on you and the economics faculties. And you have the capacity to look at what are the right lessons that you can draw from the good experiences. What is relevant when looking at Turkey, or when looking at South Asian examples, or when looking at the Baltics, or looking at other countries that have performed well? What are the lessons that you can draw and then feed that into the public debate? And I think the economics profession can play a very, very important role in this. And the more I think some of these debates in the end are depoliticized, not just being against and for, but becoming more technical. I think that sometimes helps in a situation that seems to be becoming a little stale in the debate because of issues other than the economic ones that dominate the debate.
Okay.
Hello, I'm Julian, a student at IK. My question is about, well, I think that there was many speculations before about doubting on